forgive me if some of this looks like an advertisement. If so, you can chastise me later. So I'm going to throw all these things up here real quick so we can talk about them. So essentially what the IGS profit calculator gets at is when we put in the information for a particular set of calves, it is running two different break-even calculations simultaneously. One is a break-even on what we have tried to identify as that quote-unquote average calf in the industry. To give you a sense, that's a calf that is a high degree Angus from a health standpoint, is not extreme one way or the other, would probably comparable to what folks would refer to as like a back 24 type approach. And so in some markets, I recognize some would say, well, our cattle in this area are farther along from a health status or an environmental impact status, probably. Then on the other hand, there are areas of the country where that might even be an overestimation of the health status of the calves. And so what's happening is it's running these two different break-even prices, one for the information on the cattle I put in, one for this average calf, and the report comes out then as the deviation between those two break-evens. And then as a result then, since it's a break-even, the higher break-even or the higher relative value, the difference betwixt those two, means that the buyer could justify paying more if that relative value is higher and still break even. Now, we know that no one's going to intentionally go to a set of calves and say, if they are worth X more, then I'm going to pay that entire X just to turn around and break even again. That's not practical. That's not realistic. The hope for this entire tool is that we can make feeder calf values pervasive within the industry so that we're aware on all sides the true value of the calves that are in front of us at a given moment. And so our belief is that if producers have this as essentially a marketing tool, an independent arbiter, if you will, of potential value of their calves, and if a buyer grows comfortable with that independent tool, then they're willing to go a few pennies more. Maybe not the full value, the full relative value difference. In fact, almost certainly not. They're not likely to tie up more cash that they're going to pay interest on and all of those things just to break even again. But if they can buy a few more pennies out of that situation, that's a win. Going forward, this tool will be, go ahead, does someone have a question? Oh, just a beep, I'm sorry, ignore my comment. Going forward, this will be administered by various staff at the IGS Breed Association partners. There are potential for other folks to get involved in administration of this tool, but at this point, that's kind of where that stands. Again, of course, you probably know, if not, the IGS database is by some margin the largest in the industry, reflects a myriad of breed types and breed compositions, and it's pushing 20 million head. We use market data in a number of places within this calculator where especially where it can fill in some voids. I think we would argue we have the best science team in this particular field, and a real key piece to this tool is that there will be zero charge for this profit calculator run. That our goal is to not use this as necessarily a direct means of revenue. We feel like we add value to elite seed stock producers if they are helping their customers move the needle in terms of profitability. So from breed association standpoints, we see this as essentially a service that we offer to our members to help them encourage a greater uptake of profit-focused principles as they make decisions down at the commercial level. This is just a screenshot of the interface of the profit calculator. This thing is constantly evolving nearly every week. There's a tweak behind the scenes. This is pretty mundane. There's nothing here that's just super exciting necessarily. And to be clear, this isn't a screen that a producer would use. This is the screen that somebody who is running the system, that is actually handling the interaction with the simulator would use. And we'll go to this live here in a few moments, and we can punch in a few animals to give you a sense of how it actually works. But I wanted you to see that this is the screen that it looks like. Just going to run a couple quick examples for you, nothing too exotic. Here's just a pretty normal, everyday kind of situation that you all see in southern Oklahoma, I'm sure. And so if we were to compare a couple different sets of bulls, We've got a small bull battery of low indexing Limousin bulls, and we've got a set of high indexing Limplex bulls on those Hereford Angus cows. For the sake of our conversation, we have a preconditioned calf that weighs about 600 pounds. I'm getting a little feedback, and so if it continues to get bad, if you all are hearing it, you can just mute your side until you have a question. It might reduce feedback if you're hearing that as well. All right, here are those two runs just kind of overlaid so we can see them together. On the left, what we have done is, if you look at the top, in both situations we have steer calves with average weights of 600 pounds. They're moderate in flesh. They're not super thin. They're not super fat and fleshy. These calves have been weaned for over 30 days. You can see we've checked a small box there. They have been vaccinated against BRD. Those are two areas that the scientific literature is very clear that has a positive impact on mortality rates and morbidity rates. And so there's some impact in the calculator, and because those boxes are checked to reduce both mortality and morbidity. And so there's a health status that gets better because of those are checked. You can look there. There are two gray bulls, and when we input these, and again, we'll show it to you live in a few minutes, but when you input these bulls, the Titus bull and the Mr. Warden bull are full Limousin bulls. Both are very low indexing from a profitability standpoint. We go down lower. We can enter the maternal grandsires on a cow herd. We can essentially build a cow herd by their own sires and actually get a pretty clear snapshot of that cow herd. We also realize that probably as often as not, if maybe not the bulk of the time, those sires may or may not actually be known. And so we needed a mechanism to look at a situation without knowing maternal grandsires. And so we use mark breed differences to accomplish that. And in this case, we have a cow herd that we do not know the sires, but we do know that they are Angus Hereford cattle. And then under, to steal Wade's terminology, again, just EPDs and accounting. So this machine cranked out its numbers and generates using the EPDs that are built from those two bulls and the marked breed differences that come from those Angus and Herefords, and then some of the assumptions from the accounting that you see put in up at the top, and it generates the biological outputs you see at the bottom. Now, and we'll talk about those because there's probably a couple that make you scratch your head just a little bit. Before we talk about more on the bottom, on the right, we have those two high-indexing bulls, the Magzale and Magzionism bull. Both of those bulls are on the top end of the Limousin population for their mainstream terminal index, same Angus Hereford cow base. And you can see in this situation, there's about nearly a $7 difference per hundredweight, or 7 cents a pound difference between the calves that come out of there from a relative value standpoint. Now, we can see there's some issues on the bottom that probably have caught your attention. And if you look at the feed conversion rates, the days on feed, potentially the carcass weights, and the yield grade, and the number of choice and the yield grades, your gut might be telling you, and I think accurately so, that the simulator is feeding these cattle too long. And what is happening is it's feeding these cattle to a point where their conversion drops just a little bit, they're on feed just a little bit too long, the carcass weights on occasion get a little bit too heavy. A lot of the cattle grade, in some cases, maybe a little bit of an overestimation of their ability to grade. And as a result, sometimes yield grade 4s and 5s get way too extreme. For example, the group on the right, nobody is going to feed a set of cattle to where half of the cattle, 52% in this situation, get to yield grade 4s and 5s. And so we're just not looking to take those kind of discounts. So what's happening here, and Wade can speak more to the science behind it, and we've identified this, is essentially we're going to have to find a mechanism to truncate this based on either weight or yield or fat cover so that we can cease and turn off at some point how far out this simulation runs. That's something the team's working on now, so that's not lost on us at any level. We know that that's there. Some of this has to do with the age-adjusted endpoint of marked data instead of a finish-adjusted endpoint. And so I'll hold my water and let Wade speak a little more to that if he wants to. He can either chime in now or chime in a little bit later. But through this simulation, that's about $40 a calf, even given the fact that the second group is distinctly heavier in terms of condition. So we're going to throw up another. Yep. Go ahead.
One question, just clarification before you go on. So looking at those yield grades where you have, like, say, on the right side, 48% being 1, 2, and 3. So that's saying that if you had 100 head, or however many of these exact same type calves, that 48% of them would be 1, 2, and 3, 52% being 4s and 5s, correct?
Exactly.
Or a 48% chance that this single calf would be a 1, 2, and 3.
Correct.
So this current, I have a question about what if we have known historic carcass data? Is there a way to either backdoor that by adjusting the cow herd, or is there a way to enter known carcass quality?
At present, no, and I will let Wade speak on that. I'm sure he has an interest to say something on this. Obviously, the most powerful piece is if we can get that information put in on sires, and if we can put information in on sires and get their genetic predictors more accurate, we can incorporate them as maternal grandsires and get a much better snapshot coming in that direction. But I'll let Wade make a comment on that. Or maybe I won't.
So I've also got a question on that. You mentioned that the it's not doing the good calculation on yield grade 1, 2s, and 3s, or it looks like choice or above. That's pretty optimistic. But also, I'm assuming once y'all fix that, it'll also correct for carcass weight, because I'm going to make the assumption that that carcass weight is going to adjust, but may not go down as much as you might anticipate, just because you adjust your yield grade. So they're going to finish out probably higher yielding, but still probably very similar on carcass weight for the number of days on.
Yeah. So essentially, all of this stuff is all tied to that same singular piece, that these cattle are getting fed too long. And so a number of these things will come back, and you're probably right. Carcass weight probably won't come back as far as some of them will, but there will be some adjustments. And again, the math works great. What we see here is behind the scenes. The mathematics of this makes perfect sense, but the reality is that we know we don't market cattle on an age constant as mark data would suggest. And so we will then have to put in a piece that says, okay, once you hit a certain fat level or a weight, which typically are the two triggers to decide when you've said, okay, we've gone far enough, you got to go. So or potentially conversion rate, obviously. And so we can put in triggers that just truncate the calculation at that point in time, and then we probably have something that's a bit more reflective of the real world. And so we're very comfortable in terms of how we've acquired these numbers, and we believe that from an EPD standpoint, again, which we have a tremendous amount of confidence, obviously, in that side of the equation, but from an EPD standpoint, we're comfortable here. But once we truncate those, you're exactly right. We are going to back up, for example, on this right side. I don't think we anticipate these cattle to grade. We don't expect cattle that are essentially a quarter Hereford and roughly a quarter Limousin to grade 99%. I don't think that we anticipate that to happen. That's likely to back up as the yield grade percentage goes much 1, 2, and 3 goes much higher, and as maybe we go from days on feed to 283, maybe back some number of days. And so that's something that, again, Dr. Spangler's working on right now as we speak. He and the programmer and Wade had conversations about that yesterday. And so, again, that's moving forward at a pretty rapid clip. But I want to just show you essentially all the warts and all, so that you know exactly what we're seeing, so that you feel as confident. And that way, when we come back to you in some number of weeks and show you the updated version, you'll be like, okay, gotcha, makes sense.
Yeah, one other question.
I just wanted to say that I've had trouble with my audio through the computer, so I've logged in through the phone. I thought I was talking giving an eloquent response and I was talking to myself. So anyway, if you guys have anything, I didn't hear everything Chip had responded to, but I think one of the things I'd like to respond to is the question about adding existing, basically phenotypes, adding existing information from herds, and I suppose you could develop a system that could incorporate information from known herds, past information, but it's pretty difficult to get, being you're just dealing with raw phenotypes, it's pretty difficult to leverage that to much of predictive ability without having it turned into the form of an EPD, which is obviously what we're doing. This is all driven off of EPDs, so that would kind of be my response to that. We had talked about something along those lines, but it's just getting to that point and then knowing how to meld it. I mean, we know the EPDs having information on the sires, the known sires, is going to get us, from a genetic standpoint, the best prediction we can get in how to, meld any additional information that would come directly from commercial herds. Would be pretty hard to balance that. Even if you wanted to try to incorporate the information, it would be difficult.
I think the one other question I had, we were talking about the endpoint for the cattle, and that, typically that's driven by fat or weight, and I agree, but there are times, as we've seen in the market, where because of market conditions, people have kept the cattle longer than they probably should have, or some of those things, and I just wondered if there was any way in this, or do you just totally leave this out of the equation of being able to take in some of those market type implications, or include, like you have the anticipated price for feed, are you assuming that people are going to be using, futures price? And I guess that's my question. Is there any way to account for those market conditions in this?
Well, I'll speak to that. I'll try to speak to that. So, starting out, this model, if you're into simulation modeling, is what you'd call a model that has a high level of aggregation. In other words, we're not getting down on the biological level when it comes to modeling. We're using very high level relationships and so forth. So that's one thing, and because of that, things like Chip mentioned, that okay, so in the real world, if you have cattle that tend to get fat quickly, you're going to kill them earlier. Well, this time the model doesn't have the artificial intelligence to do that. We probably are going, as Chip mentioned, we're going to make some modifications to it in order to reflect things more realistically in the real world. But at the end of the day, our goal really isn't to get down to lower levels of aggregation. We're really simulating biology, at the root level. And because of that, and one of the reasons behind that is we're giving, the primary use of this will be for producers who have some, a pen of calves to sell, and they come to us and they want them valued, and that value is something that is going to be used across the board. For example, there might be, a number of people at plan, or a number of pens that are going to sell on superior auction. And to make it a fair comparison, apples to apples, for those buying those pens of calves, we're going to make some assumptions that are pretty general. And, though they're general, they're going to be, for the most part, fairly accurate prediction of, using them will give us a fairly accurate prediction of outcome. Now, if you get into things deeper biologically, if you want to simulate what happens if you wean your calves early and put them on feed right away, or you wean your calves and put them on the stocker program and then put them into feedlot, those kind of things, we're really not equipped and probably don't have the intention to get to that level of simulation. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that, you know, there's going to be some things, if you're really wanting a biological model that gets down to the roots, this isn't it.
To add one piece, go ahead.
Just a real quick question. So on the top up there, the very last line in the top box where it says base carcass price, is that I'm assuming a futures price?
So that's a great question, and actually that's exactly where I was going to go next. So as Wade said, what we really want to do is, in particular within a given window of a feeder calf marketing period, those three economic assumptions, and then all the premiums and discounts that are built in on the backside of this thing for quality grade, yield grade, carcass weight, those sort of things. Our goal is to keep those as static as we can within a given feeder calf marketing period. Now, recognizing there could be some major catastrophic things that have a huge shift in corn or something like that, in which case we would adjust. But what we would look to do is actually those three pieces would not be adjustable from the typical administrator of this program. Those would be set and established per the management group or the oversight group, and those would say static for a period of time. Now, your question is great, because in maybe one of the things that, you know, Wade was kind of hitting at on one side of this, and kind of to the earlier question, is you could have a version of this, or folks who had an access to a version of this, where they could adjust those things more extensively. That's not difficult to do, should we have a reason to do that, to give a group the ability to adjust those. So if I were a feedlot individual and I wanted to maybe utilize this tool, and should we go down that road to use this as a tool that might become a part of a break-even for them, they very much would probably want that tied to the board. In fact, we're quite confident of that. At present, those are just current prices. That's actually not a current price, as you all know. If you looked at any carcass prices lately, 160 isn't current. But for the most part, those are going to stay in the moment USDA-based prices. Now, we very much could tie them to the board, and there's a lot of reasoning to do that. And so we're open to your perspective on that. We're not married to that approach one way or the other.
My thoughts are is you know, if we've got, in this example, you've got basically 9 days difference on days on feed, but you could have a significant difference on days on feed. Maybe it's where it's enough where it pushes the marketing of those cattle from one contract to another. And we've seen, especially in the recent history, there can be significant differences on that fed cattle price. You may be a $5 to $6 difference moving from one contract to another, and that to me would be a maybe I'm wrong, but to me that would have a pretty significant impact on that break-even value.
So, yeah, one thing I'd keep in mind though, so we're not trying to predict we're trying to predict relative outcome. So yeah, there's no question that, you know, what you just mentioned can shift. Break even can fluctuate up and down in a very short period of time. But what we're actually predicting is less variable. So we're predicting relative values. So if a set of calves versus another set of calves is worth $10 more a hundredweight, there's no question that, you know, from 1 week to the next, the break-even cost could go, you know, you could have a $1.50 break-even in a few weeks, or even less time than that, jump up to $1.70. You know, that kind of thing certainly can happen. But what tends to not happen with very much frequency is the relative value. So if there's $10 relative value between those two sets of calves, you know, when they're at $1.50, say the one's average and the $10 is more, that's $1.60, and you tend to see pretty similar relative values, you know, regardless of the break-even price. So that I'm not saying that the break-even price couldn't affect the relative value. It does some, but it's much more invariant than just predicting break-even price. So we're really not, we're using break-even, but we're not making any claims about it predicting the actual break-even.
Wade, could you you or Chip go and say again how you determine average?
Well, we have a set of, we've taken from our database over a 4-year period, the most recent 4-year period, the average characteristics were essentially it's average Angus. It's an average Angus set of calves. We've taken the average characteristics for all the traits that affect profit in the feedlot. So we've got the average, we essentially calculate an average intake, an average gain, average carcass weight, average marbling, and average yield rate. And that's based off of, those are average EPDs. We equate the EPD to the actual phenotype. The phenotypes we're getting from Meat Animal Research Center. If you go to Meat Animal Research Center, it says the average Angus carcass is, I don't know, 900 and some pounds. The average Angus marbling is 5.2, and you know, those kind of things. That's where we're getting the phenotypes. We're mapping them onto the EPDs, and that's how we come up with this average steer. And we just reason that, you know, the maybe average isn't the best. Maybe the mode. Maybe the mode is the best description of what this average is, because by far the most common steer to run through a pen of steers to run through any kind of sale would be Angus. They'd be Angus steers. So we're doing the best we can to mimic the average, the set of average Angus steers based on all the characteristics that impact feedlot profit.
Okay, so if you wanted to, I mean, depending on where you're at in the country, you know, say you go into the southeast and there's a lot more Brahman influence. So if you wanted to make your comparison to something that's maybe a little different than that average, would you run just essentially what you've done here with, on the left-hand side, you've got what somebody here could determine we think is average, and then on the right-hand side, what our producers are trying to sell? Is that legitimate?
Yeah, that certainly could be done, Brian. It'd be a matter of, you know, just like we did with Angus, come up with what we are, you know, the best estimates we could of the average Angus feeder calf, you know, and that we've set that as a base. And, you know, if someone were to want to, now it's not set up to easily do that now, but that wouldn't be a major undertaking. We could essentially set up any kind of genotype as the average base. If it was a straight, you know, somebody wanted to compare to straight Brahman, we'd go to Meat Animal Research Center and get the characteristics of the straight Brahman and do the best we could to map them onto the EPDs, and we could certainly do that. You know, the reason we picked average Angus is because that, like I said, that's by far the most common feeder calf that would be running through across the country. I'm sure there's areas where it's, you know, it would be skewed, and you wouldn't have straight Angus calves probably down in Mississippi, places like that.
Okay.
I can't say, if I could chime in one thing there, I can say, having talked to a number of producers, one thing, especially those that we would consider fairly progressive commercial producers, what they like about the concept of having a standard mode or a standard average animal is that they have the ability to maybe convince an order buyer or a feedlot buyer that they're different than their geographical region might suggest. For example, we all know that feedlot buyers build in a discount for the Southeast. It's just a given. It's the way life is. However, if someone has some sort of independent tool such as this to suggest that they are more reflective of a Midwestern or an Okie or a Nebraska situation, they might deserve a bump far above what their typical zip code or geographical region might denote. And so that has been one thing that a number of progressive producers have mentioned, as they see that this gives them a chance to say, hey, my cattle are on par with those in southwest Kansas or wherever, because they see it as somewhat of an even playing field. So, but no question, you could do either way, and I think way more than articulated.
Okay. Yeah, and I think actually getting a little bit deeper into this, so when we talk about relative value, if you look at EPDs, that's what EPDs are, and so we know if, you know, there's no sense. People all call up and they'll say, well, what does a +2 birth weight mean? I want to know if that's going to be 80 pounds or 90 pounds. Well, the reality is we can't do it worth a hoot predicting actual phenotypes. But we can, if we're going to say, okay, if a bull is +2 for birth weight, another bull is +10, you know, the relative difference between those bulls is 8 pounds in birth weight. And we can do a pretty decent job of doing that. And it's kind of the same concept here. We know that putting out an absolute value for break even, we're not going to be, we're for the reasons you guys have mentioned, that can shift dramatically in no time at all. But the relative value, just like is with EPDs, you know, that stays fairly invariant over time.
So is the back to the average, is the average an unweaned calf that has not been vaccinated against BRD?
That's a good question. Chip has been dealing with that and trying to get at what are the typical, because now you're getting into management questions. So what we try to do is say, what is the typical management exposure of the average set of feeder calves? And Chip, I'm not even sure where they've settled on that. Chip?
Yeah, I can handle that. So it's a great question. And so what we have done is try to come to an answer that seems to be practical. And so yes, the first case situation is we run that without either of the two things you just mentioned. And so that's the way that's been running. We're curious from time to time whether there should be a little bump, because certainly large portions of the country would say, well, we do have a better herd status than nothing. But at present, with the vehicle that we have set up, more or less, the simulator, for example, the one on the right, it's running exactly what you see in front of you, and simultaneously it's running that high Angus steer that weighs 600 pounds. It's not been weaned, it's not been vaccinated with the same economic assumptions on the same. So you're correct.
So the steer on the left, it only has the fact that it was weaned over 30 days and vaccinated against BRD with all its genetics. It's still only worth 3 cents a hundred more than an unweaned, unvaccinated.
Correct. And if you were to see the EPDs on those two bulls, you would understand why.
They're horrendous. Okay. Makes sense.
One other question I thought of while we're sitting here is, you know, you talk about this simulation or simulating what these values are. What we're seeing there in these relative values look like deterministic outputs. Is there a stochastic component to this where you might give these relative values where they're a range?
Yes, actually there are stochastic elements to this. Essentially what happens, you generate a pen of calves that have means for the traits of economic relevance. So you have means for average daily gain, you have means for feed intake, you have means for marbling, yield grade, carcass weight. And so then you generate, based on an assumption of variance, we generate random normal distribution around those traits. And the reason that's really necessary, it's particularly necessary when it comes to pricing for things like marbling and yield grade, where the pricing is not linear. And so because of that, you really need to have a population, generate a population with a mean and standard deviation, some distribution around that mean to correctly price things. And so what ends up happening, for example, if you start out, if you assume just a linear price when it came to marbling, in other words, if you went increased each unit of marbling gave, Chip's going to go to that. So he might as well describe this because he's been doing it.
No, go ahead. I just wanted to put it on the screen.
Well, so in this slide, this shows that, so if you have high marbling cattle already, if they're high marbling, you start out with a mean that's pretty high, and most of the cattle are already, almost all of them are in the choice area. Increasing that population for marbling, say you increase it 1 unit, in each case, high in the top graph and the bottom graph, we're improving marbling, but we're starting with different means and so forth. So what you see happening with high marbling, increasing marbling more doesn't gain you a lot, given what the assumptions we're making there for pricing. On the bottom side, you've got the same distribution, just different means, same variance, just different means. Increasing marbling in that case can make quite a difference because you're pulling the big increase. You're going from, when you go from select to choice, you're gaining $6. This is actually typical. I think we're modeling in our simulation, I think we're using about $8 if I recall. But anyway, there's a big threshold that if you cross over that threshold, that's a big impact. It has a big impact on the outcome. And of course, the fatter part of your curve centers around that threshold, it makes quite a difference in the outcome. And so that's mainly when you talk about stochastic components of the index, that's where they exist. Going back to my earlier comments, from a biological standpoint, it's very we're not modeling biology at a low level, so we don't have stochastic elements involved. Very well, being we're not at a low level of aggregation in our model of the biology, the stochastic nature is primarily just to catch the differences when it comes to pricing, or the interaction, basically, the interaction between biology and prices. And that's actually why we need to make it. So this is the underlying backbone of what we're doing, goes back to economic selection indexes. What an animal breeder would call a selection index. Well, and they're typically, most selection indexes are static. And so you plug your genetic parameters in and your prices, and you use that from and it's static. In this case, we recognize that because we're simulating, we want to cover large populations. In fact, the whole beef cattle and even dairy, Chip has been working in the dairy world, dairy cattle populations. In order to do a good job of that and catch this interaction between biology and economics, in order to do that, we need to resimulate. We need to have an interactive system where we could resimulate every time. There are a couple of other profit calculators out there, but they do not leverage, they do not resimulate. They use essentially a static selection index where the weightings are the same. In our situation, it shifts because because we're resimulating every time we run a new scenario.
Well, as Wade was talking about that, and again, that is, to be honest, that is one of the key pieces, the fact that we actually have a better reflection of the genetics involved. In particular, producers can put in more information about maternal grandsires and that sort of thing. We do a much better job of actually understanding that picture, again, at a macro level, to allow that those bell curves to shift. And that's been a big area of excitement for those who've been able to see this and watch the numbers change. And this slide kind of gets at that a little bit. What you see here is a situation where we have the same 3 sires in each simulation. You can't see them all because they're kind of covered up by each other, but 3 sires that are popular Angus bulls. Here we're marketing heifers. They weigh 550 pounds. Base carcass price is $170. And if you're familiar at all with Gardner Momentum or Basin Pay Weight, again, very impressive bulls from Terminal Merit. Keneally Power Surge is another one that's very impressive in terms of terminal merit. And so these 3 could all be AI sires, all the calves could be AI sired, or you could assume that Momentum and Pay Weight were AI sires and you were part of the consortium that owned Power Surge and he was a walking bull for you. And by the way, we do have the ability to adjust the percentage weighting on those sires. You actually see a link there that says enable custom sire representation. We could say, for example, that Momentum and Pay Weight sired 75% of the calves. Maybe we had an AI program and you got 75% of them out of those 2 bulls, and then the other quarter came from Keneally Power Surge. You could do that. In this situation, they're all viewed equally, and so they get 1/3 of the weighting. But you can see as we look at the different cow herd types how those curves shift and move. And because of the tremendous genetic merit in those 3 bulls, on all situations, they're quite positive. But you can still see a pretty distinct difference as we go from that baldy calf that has a premium of roughly 13 cents a pound over that, again, that quote-unquote average calf. And then we go to that straight-bred Angus who gets a little bit of a bump. But then when we start adding in the fundamental principles that we know to be true in terms of heterosis, you start to see as the continental breeding comes in, we get a quarter continental in there in the 3rd scenario, and again, a pretty distinct bump up of about $3.50 a hundred over the straight-bred cattle. And then as we go to that 50-50 British continental, we get all the way up to, again, nearly a 21 cent a pound or a little over a $20 a hundred bump on those calves. Again, to be clear, we caution the producers who have seen this to not think that you're going to get 20 cents extra a pound for your calves, because you're just not going to do that. But the reality is if you can prove to the buyer that, and again, especially over time as folks like myself and their colleagues work to make for awareness with feed yards, to order buyers, to those major marketers that are in the middle, and again, we're having those conversations as we speak, as they become comfortable with these, or this profit calculator relative value output, you know, if they look at that $20 number and say, okay, fine, I'm not paying you $20 more, but I might go 8 cents or something with you. I might ride a little ways and pay a little bit more in that particular situation to get calves that I know have bred-in value. And so that's something that we certainly caution folks to see. But this shows you exactly what Wade was talking about. As you shift that cow herd around, you certainly can move those. I'm going to skip over these. Wade.
I think that, you know, if you have these pieces in here where you have the variance associated with it, that would be even more powerful if you gave those relative values in a range, you know. So yeah, the mean may be $20 a hundred, but it's, you know, 16 to 22, or is it 13 to 27? You know, and I think that probably would aid that conversation with producers a little bit more.
Duly noted. I'm going to skip past this real quick just because Wade did a better job. Again, just to show that we can bring in, the beauty of this system is obviously from an IGS standpoint, we have 12 different breed associations collaborating, so getting their cattle are, I mean, instantaneous. But we also have the mechanism, and I'll show you that in a moment when we go to run this thing live. We can bring in registered cattle from outside of the system as well. You see a bull like Final Answer here, and certainly that's a bull that is highly, we all know he's very popular and used a lot, and certainly he's in our database as well. And so you can see he populates that way. Again, you can see that shift in the cow herd base in the bottom and what that does to his value. And again, a neat component of Final Answer is if you happen to be familiar with that bull, he's at the absolute top tier of the Angus population in almost every category, save back fat and yield grade. Much like a lot of common Angus, a lot of contemporary Angus cattle, or a lot of the derivatives and hybrids that have a lot of Angus breeding in them, those cattle tend to be fairly fat. And so, as you can see, the mark data reflects that when you look down on the bottom, especially when you breed Final Answer to straight Angus cows. But you can show where some of these bulls, and so customers, commercial customers can see, a lot of bulls have populations they can be successful on, just all too often they're not on the population they're most frequently used on. And so there are a lot of Angus folks using Final Answer. I would encourage them, and again, as a family who, being close to folks who have a lot of those black cows at the house, that's just not a bull that makes sense for us. But he certainly works really good on our Sim Angus cows and that sort of thing. So same example with a popular Simmental bull. He makes more sense on making 50-50 calves. Even he's good at making straight Simmental calves, but there's more value on the other. There's a lot of numbers, so I apologize. But let me tell you what you're looking at. We have recently shared this with some non-IGS breed associations because we want them to know that we're going to evaluate their cattle. We have the capacity to do that, and we want them to be comfortable with what we've come away with. And so in just the last week, I presented this to the folks over at the Hereford Association. I showed them, we broke these numbers down a lot more so that, because they know these bulls a lot better than you and I would, or certainly better than I would, and we talked about each little group, each color grouping, just a little bit independent, and then we put them all together. But here you're seeing essentially the yellow lines are those bulls in that population who have the highest terminal value through their CHB index. The bulls in that kind of pinkish color in the second tier are still in the very elite stratosphere of Hereford bulls. They're in the top 200. You can see they rank from 196 to 200 in the certified Hereford beef terminal index. The blue line is the Hereford's maternal index, what they call their balding maternal index in the blue, and then at the bottom is their Cavanese index. And so these are trait leaders in each of those categories. And then again, the EPDs you see in the middle are EPDs that are adjusted over to a Simmental base so that we can run them through this system. And then you see what they look like when they run across those different cow herds, much like we saw in the other screens, but just without all the magic. We just cut down to the number. And so you can see where some of these cattle are going to struggle from maybe just a feeder calf valuation standpoint. That does not mean that, and that would not dare suggest that that is the only measure of cow herd profitability. In fact, I think we all know that maybe in some ways in the last number of years our only focus has been on the size of the check that we sold calves, and in turn there's a lot of black cows out there that are not as fertile nor as longevity minded as they once were. And so we're not suggesting that this is the only barometer by which you measure the profit of a cow herd. But when we look specifically at the feeder calf profit, it probably doesn't come as a huge shock to folks that if we go straight bred anything, they're not as profitable as when we responsibly cross them. And again, the Hereford population has not been selected in mass for terminal merit. And so as you see that column over there towards the right under Hereford, not an overwhelmingly popular column to look at if you're looking to straight breed Hereford cattle. But as you get more Angus blood in there, or as you get back over and get more Continental and Angus blood under the Sim Angus column, or just straight Continental blood, you can see there are a number of bulls in this situation that can be very popular. And they're not all necessarily the bulls that are the most prevalent in terms of their CHB index. For example, a bull that got a lot of conversation the other day with the Hereford folks, actually there were two of them that got a lot of attention. One was the Schoolar 9U bull, who's down in the blue section. And there's a bull that isn't world leader in terms of their numbers, but he's consistent and he works on a lot of populations. And you might note he's one of the unique ones on here in that his score against, if you look at his relative value on straight Angus cows, he might be the only, or if not, he's one of the few that has a better score there than he does against Simmental and Sim Angus cattle. And you're like, well, that's a little bit unique. Why would that be? Well, actually, when you look at this guy, what happens is this Scular bull acts a little bit more like a continental relative to his population. Relative to the Hereford population, he's extraordinarily lean. He's quite heavy muscled. And so as a result, he actually works a little bit more like a continental, so then it wouldn't come as a huge shock that his greatest value might be against a British animal that had some marbling like an Angus. And so it's capturing that. And to be honest, when we went through all these with the Hereford folks, they were very tickled. They felt this did a really good job. They felt like this ranked those cattle in a way that made sense to them. And so I just wanted you to know that those folks have seen these numbers and felt pretty good when we left that meeting. This screen is a set that, in interest of full disclosure, I've not been able to show them to the Charolais cattle folks just yet, but I've just been putting them together so I can catch up with those people in the near future and do the same. And again, it doesn't come as a shock. Now here's a population of cattle who've been selected to a high degree for terminal merit. And you know, in your neck of the world, there are a lot of white bulls chasing cows around, especially as you get farther even south from you. You all are well aware of that. Again, up at the top, we have those that are in the top tier or their terminal sire index. That pinkish line are cattle who float right around the 25 percentile for that index. The blue lines, those who are on the top end of their maternal index, and again, the top end of the calving ease index at the bottom. And so what you can see, again, another situation where you see this population gets much more positive from a feeder calf value than the other. Again, I don't think that's a big epiphany to anyone because, again, they've been sorted for that. You can see some uniquenesses in here, but you can see in general it tends to line up fairly well with the terminal merit of those bulls, with the bulls being towards the top, having a higher degree, a higher relative value. In fact, you can see a pretty unique bull in there. I actually skipped and grabbed him. He wasn't the 5th bull in line. He was the 6th bull. There's a bull called One Penny Blanco, who's actually 6th in the terminal sire index of the Charolais breed, but has to this point been the highest relative value of any bull that I've been able to find in their breed, mostly because he's solid in the traditional strengths of Charolais, but is quite exceptional in terms of marbling relative to that population. And so actually that allows him to be even a better fit against a straight continental like a Simmental or a high continental like a Sim Angus because of that added marbling. So just wanted to show those numbers to you. And if you can take a picture there, you can see Wade. He's even smiling. I know it's a little bit nauseating. If you don't know some of these folks, though, it's a great group.
He's only smiling because it was a candid photo. Otherwise, it would be no.
Oh, that's right. You nailed that. You nailed that. Hey, while you all are pondering, I do want to show you that we can just jump into this thing one time and show it to you live. And I want to show you a couple pieces of how it would work. And feel free to be asking any questions. And if I've skipped out of a screen too fast, I'm sorry. But I do want to take a moment to at least show you how this thing would function in the real world. So here it is. It's running live. And let's just say for the sake of our conversation, we've got, again, 575-pound steers. Again, they're a little fleshy in this group, which is unfortunate. Let's just say the reality is prices are a little bit higher now, so we're going to call this one 175. We'll use a couple of different bulls here, and I want you to know we could put in a very extensive bull battery. Wade, you might actually know the number. I've never hit the number. I put in as many as 8 bulls as direct sires, and I put in as many as 5 bulls per year that were maternal grandsires, so that I had a screen of, I don't know, the better part of 30 bulls or so. And so you can go that far if you want to. To save you time watching me just punch in numbers, I don't think we need to do that. But I want to show you 2 examples. I want to show you how we would import a bull from an outside breed, but then I also want to show you how we would do this. And so, if I had a bull that's in, yeah, go ahead.
Chip, just a thought. You may not have much background on what integrity beef is, but the majority of these cattle are Charolais sired on Angus type cows. So in one of the it's a lot of, high growth, top 20% weaning weight, yearling weight bulls, but low accuracy, So that'd be something interesting if we could do whenever to look at that. So just want to throw that in there real quick. Go ahead.
Yeah, they're going to be about 2/3 to 3/4 early sired.
Okay, very good. Yes, we can absolutely do that. I'll go ahead and punch in a couple different versions. One, just so you can see how it works. I'm just going to use a couple, one or two bulls that are internal to us, and so you can see how we would do that. And again, we can use, in fact, a lot of, let's just say a very large proportion of popular Angus sires here in our database, so we could easily add them as well. Here is a Simmental bull that's quite popular. I'm going to put in a Red Angus bull.
So is that just their registration number putting in there?
They're universal IDs, yes.
Okay.
And we can leverage any of those 12 groups that are within us. We can automatically search our database that way. I'll show you how we'll grab those other ones in just a second. So
universal
again,
ID. Just real quick, universal ID. That's not the breed registration number. That's some sort of a different listing.
Actually, typically they're a similar thing. Actually, the universal ID typically just has that registration number with a prefix relative to the country that it was originally registered in, and then a breed code. And so you can see here, I don't know how well you can see it from where you're sitting, but right here it says USA SM, and then this 2614607, that's his registration number with us, and so this just becomes his universal ID. I can put in an Angus bull, and I put it in as USA AA, and then his reg number.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you want, it's actually Interbull. It complies with Interbull, and Interbull over in Europe is kind of the governing body of all things identification-wise. And so, as Chip says, you got a country code and a breed code, and then typically the reg number from the breed where it originated. Now, one of the things we struggle with some is, there's a lot of bulls anymore that are in many different breed databases, so that throws a bit of a monkey wrench into it. But we do, if you want to read up on any of that stuff, just Google Interbull identification, and there's all kinds of information about how they operate or what their protocol is.
Okay, so here, that's just an example of how this thing would run. This is essentially a Simmental Red Angus program, which is a reasonably common program within some parts of the country. And so you can see a pretty popular high-indexing bull in our population, in the Simmental population. The Frankly bull is a pretty popular high-growth Red Angus bull, and just putting them on marked breed assumptions for Red Angus Simmental, unknown maternal grandsires. You can see the relative value associated with those. Now, I'm not going to take the time to do it, but I will show you how we'd put maternal grandsires in, just for the interest of time. We could say we were retaining 15% of heifers. I could say I know 7 years worth of bull battery, and what I would do is, you could see here, it's going to click all the way back those 7 years. Here's 1 and 2 don't matter because obviously they don't have calves in this population. And so I could put in those reg numbers right here. And again, I could put in a number of them to represent that particular year. And again, I can go all the way down and fill that out for all of those years. Other things to show you while I'm here, you can see when I hit this link here, it immediately came up with a 50% and a 50% here. Now, I could change that if, in fact, the Tebow bull is reflective of 75% of the calves, and the Frankly bull now is worth 25. And by the way, it won't let me put in numbers that don't make sense. It will, it'll balk at me if the math doesn't add up. And then I could go back to what I did before, just for this. And that's not a surprise to me that would go higher because of, again, while this bull is good within his Red Angus population, the Tebow bull is excellent within the Simmental population, and so he went up just a little. So I want to show you how I would add in a custom sire. All right. Oh, forgive me. I don't know all these bulls I don't know all the Charlet bulls off the top of my head. So
I'll give you one real quick.
Hey, it'd be great.
Go ahead, Robert.
Okay.
No, hold on a second. To do it, I actually have to, at present, the programmer is currently building in a mechanism to where I can put in the direct Charlet EPDs. I can't, at present, I have to have converted them prior to and adjusted them over by using mark or crossbreed adjustments. So I can't just import, at this point, a bull directly. I have to do some math to put him in. And so if you have one, I mean, I could do it. It would take, if you've got a few minutes, I can adjust him. It's not that hard. If you have questions to Wade, I can certainly do it. If you have a bull you want me to look up, I don't mind doing that.
I can give you one that's heavily used in our alliance. You want the name, or you want the, what do you want? Registration number or the EPD?
I prefer his reg number. If you have his EPDs, I'm not going to argue, but I can go get them while you're chatting.
I've got all that sitting here in front of me on my phone. His reg number is E.
I'm sorry. I cut
Ready?
His reg number is what? Yes.
All right. Registration number EM 665948.
Okay.
And which EPDs do you need? The TSI?
Okay. No, what I need is birth, weaning, yearling. I'm going to ask for a number of them. Let's start with those. Birth, weaning, yearling.
Okay, birth is 2.4.
Okay.
Weaning 38.
Okay.
Yearling is 68.
Okay. Now give me the carcass weight.
Carcass weight 27.
Okay. Give me back fat, ribeye, and marbling.
Back fat 0.003.
Okay.
Ribeye 0.6.
Okay.
Marbling negative 0.18.
0.18. Okay. All right. I'm going to let you pick Wade's mind for a minute while I pull his numbers up. Okay.
So you're not actually using the TSI that they've recently developed then?
No, which is actually, some of the Charlet folks are actually pretty pleased with that, because when I actually talked to a Charlet breeder this morning or late yesterday. It all runs together. And again, the TSI is just an index that comes from those same numbers. And
right.
They were pretty pleased to see that our use of EPDs came out and found a similar situation to where those cattle were ranking similar to their TSI, which isn't a big shock. I mean, indexes work. We're firm believers in indexes, and they work. Yep. It sounds like, again, I'm not a Charlet person. I have heard there had been a little bit of scuttlebutt amongst this person and that about, was it ranking them correctly? And certainly I wouldn't have a comprehensive awareness of that, but I can tell you in the limited number of bulls that I've ran, it sure seems like it's hitting the mark.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna turn my screen off for a minute while you all can talk to Wade, and I'll run these for you real quick. It'll actually take me just a few minutes to do some math.
Okay. You got any questions for
I guess, Wade, I was kind of curious, y'all are continuing to work on this. What is the timeline for kind of like rollout or use publicly available, or, in terms of if we wanted to gain access and use this, or what are your thoughts on that?
Wade, did we lose you?
Oh, sorry. I guess I was on mute there. So, I figured Brian didn't want to hear me. Brian didn't want to hear me anyway. So anyway, the game plan is to have something that we feel comfortable with and does what we feel it needs to do for its purpose out sometime this spring. We've been hesitant to give drop-dead dates because, as you guys know, when it comes to this kind of stuff, developing technology, you get thrown curveballs now and then, and so having a drop-dead date usually is not a good idea. But the game plan is this spring. You know, when it comes to any kind of research stuff, I mean, our philosophy has always been we just share. I mean, I don't think we'd have any trouble. We'd have to talk to the other people involved. But if you guys were interested in the fact that you've got a research application, you know, we could certainly share it with you at pretty much any point in time. That's generally how we do things. We have, you know, and the other thing is it's you know, it's always going to be a work in progress. There's always going to be room for improvement, and that's the way simulation modeling is, and most any technology is. We'll see improvement, indirect improvement through, you know, enhanced EPD prediction. It won't be long. We're going to have a new platform, and we actually do. We rolled out a trait stability. We rolled out the first what's called a multi or single step EPD on a large database when we calculated stability before Christmas, and that means that we now have the capability of incorporating DNA calls directly from the lab right into the evaluation directly, and that's pretty powerful. It increases our predictive ability substantially on young animals, and you know, that's what most of what everybody deals with are low accuracy young animals. You know, I'm sure most of your producers, if they're buying bulls, you're dealing with that category of animals, and in general, that's, you know, what most everybody's dealing with in the beef industry. So that's going to enhance our predictive ability on the biological side, and then we'll, like I say, it's going to always be a work in progress, and we'll work to enhance and add features and those kind of things over time. But, you know, yeah, we shoot to have something from a production standpoint, something out this spring yet.
Can you all see my screen? Can you all see my screen again real quick?
Yes, we can.
Wait, this is Deke Alcar. I was curious if you would maybe run an overall or a very broad general value determination based on, you know, a general cow herd description across all integrity beef producers, and then we could give you a list of many sires, or, you know, maybe even all of them, but definitely multiple sires, to give us a general idea across the whole integrity beef cow herd. Would that be possible?
Yeah, I think, you know, if we assimilate the sires they've used on the calves and the sires of the dams and those kind of things, we can do that. We can come up with, we can even do it external. You have, if the sires are in the evaluation and have EPDs, you know, it can pretty quickly be done even external to the simulation to come up with a, you know, a set of EPDs that would be comparable. We'd use the mark, the crossbreed adjustments, and put them on whatever base you wanted. Typically, people want an Angus base. So if it sounds like you've got a lot of Charolais cattle in the mix. I don't know if you've got Charolais females too on top of that. But anyway, we could put something together. Chip mentioned, so right now we're limited to 20 sires when it comes to the sires of the calves and the sires of the dams that we can input into the simulator, into the feeder profit calculator. But that can easily be ramped up too, you know. So we could conceivably use a simulator. If we ramped up the number of sires allowed, we could, you know, we could get a gauge through the simulator on what the genetic level of a herd was, or a population. So what, can you give me more background on what this actually is?
I was going to say real quick, if needed, we can provide you with every sire that contributes to the calf crop, either by ranch or if you just wanted it just as a whole listing. But that is a requirement that they have to provide the alliance with the sire information for every calf that's contributed to the calf crop. So we know every sire.
And they're evaluated sires. They're in some database or some genetic evaluation.
Yes, they have to be registered. The 2016 calf crop, the 2017 calf crop, of course, it's being born right now, will either be Angus sired or Charolais sired. In the future, they have opened it up to Red Angus, but of course we won't see any of those at the earliest until 2018. With one exception, we do have one producer that was grandfathered in with Red Angus, and then we're waiting on a proposal from the Hereford Association to develop a relationship with them. But for the 2017 calf crop, it'll be probably 2/3 to 3/4 Charolais sired, and then about the rest will be Angus.
Well, probably the quickest way to get a gauge, if you look at the cow herd, you pull in EPDs on the sires of the females that are raising the calves, and then, I don't know, in most cases you just make a general assumption, within a herd that they're siring animals equally, although there might be cases where you vary that and give different weightings. So for instance, if you had a herd where half the daughters were out of an AI sire or were out of AI, you could vary that, and then you just weight things accordingly. And of course, you could do the same thing on the calves and to come up with a mean, and that could fairly quickly be done in a spreadsheet if you had the EPDs to get a handle on that kind of thing. And then, but before you started, you'd want to, you're going to be pulling, if you've got Angus and Charolais, you've got two different bases, EPD bases, so you'd have to make a conversion. You'd either convert the Angus to Charolais or vice versa, and then proceed from there.
Sure. And Wade, this just from my perspective, I don't know how much maternal sire data there's going to be, but there's some producers that know that. And then the other thing, to speak to your point there, would be probably two different simulations. One would be integrity beef cows with Angus sires, and then a different simulation for integrity beef cows with Charolais sires. I think makes sense. Robert, you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I would agree on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things, so when it comes to
No, did we lose Wade?
Yeah, it looks like his phone might have dropped, but he'll come back on.
Okay. Well, while he's working that out, let me show you what we've done with that bull example that we had a moment ago. So we can identify him, and again, I could put his name here, but at this point it didn't. We can keep track of him, especially as we go forward. We'll be able to track that guy, and his reg number, this terminology here will change. The programmer's changing that to his universal ID or his registration number. These are the EPDs on that bull once he's converted to a Simmental base. And so this is, again, the EPDs of relevance for the feeder profit calculator. So are there any questions on that? Because once I hit the next button, those will go away. We won't be able to see them. Fair enough. So I could put in, now he could, again, because a lot of the groups that we work with or some other associations might have composite animals. In this case, it's 100% Charolais. So we'll add him to the deal. Now, you can see this bull, and I didn't put his fancy name or anything of that nature in, but he put in just like all the other bulls that we had seen to this point. From now on, he's figured exactly the same. And so if I understand correctly, it sounds like the bulk of these bulls will be going on, at least high likelihood, on high Angus cows. Oh, Damn thing logged me out. Sorry, hold on. I sat still long enough, I guess, that it's going to make me log back in. I know how these things work, so we'll go over here and we'll do it again. That's what happens when I sit still very long. That's how Wade keeps me motivated. He's a heartless taskmaster. That's just the way it is. So, anyway, I think we'd used a fleshy one in that previous example, so we'll leave it the same. And I think we're at about 175. Again, so we're gonna. Well, you're gonna get to. That's him. So you're gonna get to see me walk back through this one time. I apologize for that.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, guys. I'm really struggling here. I lost connection, and then I had to dig up all the access codes and stuff to get back on. But anyway, I was just quickly I was going to speak to the fact that most commercial cow herds on the dam side, you're typically shooting in the dark. But what you can do that does certainly add value is you get some that at least a breed. You get some estimate of breed. And so if we know, the cows, you got a set of cows that are half Angus, half Simmental, you might not know, or half Angus, half Charolais, you might not know what they're sired by, but at least we can get a mean estimate on those breeds, where they're going to sit for the various traits. And so you definitely want, if as much information as you can get on the dams, and if all you have are breed makeup, in some cases you don't even have that, I guess, but if you have breed makeup, that's certainly of value.
So herein is the relative value of that particular bull. You can see pretty clearly still the bark breed assumptions are doing a few things that we know need to get better. We're not going to feed these cattle 300 days or 299 days. The feed conversions get a little poor on the, well, they don't get a little poor, they get fairly poor. Again, because they're going too far, carcasses that are flirting with 1,000 pounds, and this group's probably, the percent choice is probably reasonably close, but probably the yield grade 1, 2, and 3 is actually going to probably equal a little bit higher. But again, it gives you, again, from a relative standpoint, it gives you a sense that these cattle are worth $11.59 more per hundred. Does that line up a little bit with your perspective on this bull?
Yeah, I've got a producer that has used a lot of his bulls, and that bull's he's actually an AI sire. What we'll see is he'll come in about 75% choice or better, 75 to 80% choice. Yield grades 1, 2, and 3 would be down just a little bit. Deke, that's the field rep bull that Rusty uses, has a lot of genetics out of, Deke. So that's pretty close. Of course, carcass weight is a little higher, but I think, like you said, that's attributable to trying to feed them for 300 days.
Sure.
So did the breeder pick that? Did the breeder decide to use that bull based on an index? Is he a pretty high terminal indexing sire?
Yes, he's a very high indexing. He's got high accuracies.
Yeah.
Well proven bull in our area.
Yeah, like Chip said earlier, one of the things, we generally see a pretty good ranking with how the animals rank on selection indexes. One difference though is that we're, like I said, the selection index is kind of a one-size-fits-all and one scenario modeled. And if you have that exact scenario, we'll probably be even closer. But with the feeder profit calculator, we have the latitude to simulate, quite a bit of alternative scenarios and pricings and all that kind of stuff. But generally, a selection index of an animal sizes, a lot of people are asking, gee, should we be using the feeder profit calculator to select sires? Well, no. It uses the same concept as a selection index, but it's got some things like we factor in heterosis in the feeder profit calculator. We pull out heterosis purposely in the selection index, and all kinds of number of other things that make a selection index the tool you want to use for making selection purposes. The feeder profit calculator, we really need to make it clear to producers that it's not a selection tool. It's to use to get the best prediction we can come up with for what a set of calves is worth. But yeah, if you're using high terminal index sires, they're going to size up good on the feeder profit calculator.
So Wade, that leads to my next question. If that was a low accuracy bull, how much would that relative value change? Would it go away completely?
It's not tied to accuracy. So the beauty of EPDs is they are. So if you start out with no knowledge, you take a population of cattle, you have no knowledge of what those cattle are. The best estimate would be to call them all the same. Whatever the mean is, that's what the set of that population is. So as you gain more and more information, you see more and more spread in EPDs. And so that is why it's statistically okay, mathematically okay, to not factor in accuracy, because accuracy is actually factored into the calculation of the EPDs. So it does not affect the value. We're using the EPDs, whether they're high accuracy, low accuracy EPDs, we're using those as predictions of the biological merit. Then the other part about this is that when you take a basket of EPDs or several sires, a number of sires, the means of those, we're using means of those sires. The means of those, if you take, say, for instance, you take 5 young bulls and you take their means, their mean EPDs, that would be equivalent to using a high accuracy sire. You would see the variation or the movement, the error in those EPDs collectively, out of those 5 sires, would be probably equivalent to a high accuracy single sire. So accuracy isn't factored into this.
Thank you.
A quick question on up there on that the last box before the output, where you have dam breed 1 and dam breed 2. Is that just taking it, so a 50, if you change that to, say, Angus and Brahma, would it be assuming that's a 50% Angus, 50% Brahman? Or can you put in there that it's, so we know in this part of the country we'll have a lot of what we call ultra blacks. So they're going to be probably like a 3/16, under, they'll be a little under, purebred Brangus type scenario.
Yeah, so you can see that is moving. This relative value moves with that herd exactly as you just described. And so, again, this isn't necessarily the ultra black distinction. It's not even a Brangus distinction, but it's reasonably close to an ultra black because it's a, for the sake of this conversation, and you can see that changes. And if we put them on some tiger stripes down in Mississippi, I'm guessing this will get a little bit less beautiful. Yeah, I'm not surprised. And so, so that's what you see. If we get down there, and of course, there are a reasonable number of Brahman continental crosses down, especially in your world and south. And so, again, you can eke that back up. As long as the Brahman blood's not in there, you all understand there's profit to be had in that cow herd, but it's more on the production side than it is on the feeder calf value side. So, so this is not a knock of the place of those girls, but they're making more money in the pasture than they are at this point. So.
Just out of curiosity, do an Angus Brangus cross. That'd be kind of that super, or that ultra black type. That'd be about as close as we can get.
Oh, I hit the wrong button. Sorry. Hold on.
Okay.
You can see that pushes that Brahman content down relatively low at that point. So,
this gets back to kind of my thought process earlier. You're setting a static spread for yield and grade, or for quality grade and yield grade. So, you know, what we tell our producers, if they're going to retain ownership into a yard, you definitely want to pick a yard. If you've got Brahma influenced cattle or even some continental type cattle, that you'll probably want to, you're going to want to sell them on a yield basis, not on a grade basis, to be able to try
Understood.
to put, you know, instead of trying to bang a round peg into a square hole.
So the question in that, I guess, is there an ability, if we're working with you guys on this, to change some of those grid characteristics, maybe?
Yeah, so Chip had mentioned that, so we've been talking with Meat Animal Research Center. One of the struggles is that, as Chip mentioned, the Meat Animal Research Centers, their data is assuming animals are all killed the same age. Well, we know that that's not the case. We know that if you had a set of Simmental, high proportion Simmental feeder calves versus a high proportion Angus set of feeder calves, the Angus feeder calves would die earlier, typically, because, you know, you're going to run into yield grade problems sooner, and so you're going to pull the trigger. But in the real world, so our EPDs, though, the irony is our EPDs are actually on a finished constant basis. For example, when we get a set of, say we have somebody that puts 300 calves on feed, those calves will probably be killed in 3 different groups. And so, and those groups become the contemporary group for genetic evaluation. And in that way, we're essentially sizing up cattle, and we're coming up with EPDs, genetic differences for traits, marbling, and yield grade, and so forth, based on when they were actually deemed to be finished. So anyway, that's kind of roundabout way to say that we're working on things that we think will, you know, improve the our predictive ability. Meat Animal Research can help us. I think they have some data where we can make some adjustments to where we're, instead of an age constant, we're on a finish point constant. The other thing is we can add, like earlier I mentioned about artificial intelligence. If we ramp up the level of biology in the simulator, we can put in artificial intelligence that says that, you know, you simply don't feed a pen of calves until, you know, you simply don't feed a pen of calves beyond some target yield grade. You know, that might be, you know, 20% fours and better. So you put that in, and then, you know, it has a corresponding effect on their carcass weight and their marbling and all the other factors if you're killing them sooner than you typically would based on the mark. So mark is assuming that we just take them all out to this set carcass weight and basically the same age, and that's really where when you see those funky results, that's where that's coming from.
And you think you'll have that fixed by spring?
June 1, is that what you said?
Yeah, you're good, Frank. That was kind of like when you were working on your thesis. We were trying to get timetables out of you. No, we do. Seriously, though, we really are, like Chip said. Chip's been really working on it, and you know, ideally, we would come out, we'd have something ready for production. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, and like I said, it's a work in progress and always will be, but we're kind of shooting to have something out this spring that will be good enough to do with what we feel it needs to do.
I'd say it's really, really cool, and it's one thing that we've always struggled to get at is what is the value of these cattle, especially on the genetic side. And so like you say, I mean, we can maybe assign some different values to what the value of that backgrounding is and things like that. But this is a pretty good tool of evaluating the genetic side of it. So really neat.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of discussion about that with Chip and everybody else involved about how, we know that most break-even calculators and most people that are feeding feeder calves, they have a pretty good gauge, whether it's just a gut feel or an actual objective, something objective that they've got plugged into their break-even calculator that puts a value on the weaned calf and puts a value on the vaccinated calf and puts a value on castrated calf and those kind of things. So we realize the primary thing we bring to the table here is the genetic component. That's really the primary thing we bring to the table. In fact, we're going to split out, so we're going to move to where we have a relative value. We publish a relative value that's solely based on genetics, and then another relative value that's based on the management parameters or the non-genetic factors, so people can keep them separate. And if you have already got all the other non-genetic things factored in, you don't need to double count. You don't need to use our non-genetic assumptions or non-genetic calculations. But very few, I don't know of any other than a couple of other calculators out there that would have, account for the genetic component of value of set of feeder calves.
Wade hit the big point for those of us internally who are working on this is as we try to develop some level of awareness beyond the producer level, mostly so that generates a little bit of pull-through, a little bit of recognition of the brand, of the logo, of the marketing mechanism, so that there's some recognition. And as Wade just more or less said, we all know that those on the feeding end use color, ear length, and horn status as a proxy for genetics. And so if we can give them a simple measure that gives purely a genetic relative value, it might be something that has value to them. And we've had contacts with significant entities that have suggested that.
I think putting those things together are powerful, being able to split the genetics from the management piece. And, I think, for us, we've been really curious in that genetics piece, but then also, how do you evaluate or how do you put a value on those management pieces, and it allows people to kind of change out or, compare what they think those management practices are worth. And so I think that's real important.
So just so you know, there are a few pieces that we will put in here that when this thing goes live, the way this will work is it will generate essentially a digital certificate. And so a digital certificate will put in all of the inputs that the producer gave us, so that if the producer tells us they were weaned on X day, and so it hits the 30-day mark, and yet those calves show up to whomever bought them, and they still got milk on their mouth and they're bawling, that's on the person who gave us that information, not on us. But we'll also have some other information on that certificate that we think is useful for buyers. If they were implanted, what was the date? If they're horned, are they horned or dehorned? Things that may not necessarily belong in this as a break-even calculator or a relative value tool, but actually do provide some service to the folks who are looking at this to get a better handle on the calves. So,
just curious, are you guys planning on working on a maternal component to this?
No, because that gets into the maternal component we have would be obviously the plugging in the sires of the dams and the traits, the traits that are, the only traits we're simulating are the traits that are relative to feeder calves, the value of feeder calves. When it comes to maternal, we've got our selection indexes. We've got the all-purpose index that factors in, cow herd traits as well as you know, the traits that impact the cattle that go into the feedlot. So we've got that, and like I said, we strongly encourage, or not only strongly encourage, we absolutely don't want breeders using this feeder profit calculator as a selection index. You know, even though it has, you know, the backbone of it is, it's the same methodology as the selection index. It's you know, it's not something we want breeders using as selection, and if they're going to keep replacement females, they need to be using, in our situation, they need to be using the index we call the all-purpose index. In other breeds, they call it other things, but that's what they need to be using. And because in our situation with the all-purpose index, we factor in, you know, it's called all-purpose because it factors in the feedlot, the packing plant, and the cow herd. All three of them are factored in and weighted appropriately. All the traits are weighted appropriately. And so, you know, if you're keeping replacement females, you use that index. It accounts for maternal characteristics, and generally, because it also accounts for feedlot traits, generally high API cattle generally do pretty well on the feeder profit calculator. Now you can envision a situation where they don't. They might be so superior in the cow herd traits, you know, they might have extreme longevity, you know, extreme maternal calving ease, direct calving ease, those things, and then not be so spiffy in the feedlot. You know, under that scenario, they might not shine so much in the feeder profit calculator, but we know they don't have to worry about that because they're making up for it in the cow herd.
That's just one thing we've all, you know, people struggle with, because I agree you have the all-purpose index, which kind of gives you a relative value among sires there, but then when you know, breed your Sim Angus sire to my Hereford cow, and then I produce that replacement, what's the value of that heterosis, which you've captured here in the feeder side of it? We still struggle with that on the female side of it.
Well, yeah, where you're going, Brian, is you actually getting into a decision support. Colorado State years ago, Dorian Garrick started it. He started along the path of a decision support tool where you would plug in, you know, it's interactive just like the feeder profit calculator, and you could put in there, you had straight Angus cows, you crossed them on, or straight Angus bulls, you crossed them on Hereford cows, you had these baldies, and it would factor in heterosis and everything it needed to factor in to predict profit. But that's, you know, that's something it had, they developed it fairly far along, or they were fairly far along in the development, and it hasn't gone anywhere since then. Then there was years ago, there was a USDA did a simulator they called DEFSI, Decision Evaluator for the Cattle Industry. There was Farrell and Jenkins over at Meat Animal Research for the primary researchers on that deal. They actually used a simulator we had developed at Colorado State as part of as a backbone for it, but it never really got off the ground. But there you're getting into a deep thing. You're getting into simulation that goes deeper into biology, which is great. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really is. It's needed, but it just doesn't seem like our industry has the will to go anywhere with it.
Yeah.
Chip, back on that certificate that you said you generate, couple questions. You said you're going to have it where they have to put in input the dates that they wean the calf. So will you have an output that'll show that the calf is 68 days weaned, or is it just going to be that, I know you've got to click on it, so you got to be at least 30 days to trigger that part of the model, but on the certificate, will it actually show how many days weaned the calf is? And then next question would be, also, since you're putting some just management type information on there about like implant status, Will you also be putting a place on there for the seller to be able to disclose if they're using what kind of vaccines? Is it modified live or killed? I know that doesn't factor into your model, but if you're just putting management information for the buyer to know, that we do see a differentiation in prices based upon some of that management information.
No question, and you're spot on. And we've had those exact conversations, and to this point, I think those are relatively things to just pass through, relatively easy pieces. But as far as like weaning, I would speculate we'll stick to a date only because that way it doesn't fluctuate every day. So if somebody, if they show that to somebody 2 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now, the wean date hasn't moved, and so. But
that wean date will be on this time.
Yeah, that's something that we had discussed a while back, and I just don't see any reason why we wouldn't do that. It's easy. And then the vaccination program protocol, again, we've had that conversation, and again, we haven't necessarily solidified exactly what the certificate's going to look like. That's kind of the last piece of this whole thing. But at this point, there's a very high likelihood that exact thing will be on there.
And then one last thing, PI status, PI DVD status. If you're putting pass-through information, that'd probably be another important one.
Agreed.
Yep. Guys, we've taken like 2 hours of your time now, so if there's maybe, you got one more question, Mariah?
Well, not so much question, and just to wrap up, I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I think there's definitely a place to use some of this in what we're doing. We're not so much calculating the relative value as I alluded to in the very beginning, but we're actually trying to figure a price for these people. But part of that price component is what is the value of their animals worth, what is, being in the IB, being Charlet, having these sires. And so I think that we would definitely like to continue working with y'all, and as you move forward and things are updated, be made aware of that, so that we could use pieces of this in our pricing component, if we could work that out with y'all.
Yeah, we're very, very happy to work, like I said. When it comes to research, we want to collaborate, share, help in any way we can, because our IGS, really the concept of IGS has to do with collaboration. To think that you could get 12 breed associations to work together when, typically the history of breed associations has been more like the Hatfields and the McCoys. But the goal, we realized long ago that, if we really want to help the industry, we gotta work together. So, if there's anything we can do to help you guys, we'd certainly open to it.
Well, we certainly appreciate y'all taking time to walk all the way through this with us. And like Brian said, we've taken 2 hours of time. We know that your time is valuable, so thank you.
Well worth it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all. We appreciate it a bunch.
Yeah. Take care.
Hey.
Have a good day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You still there?
Thank you.